portion. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, melech ha'olam, asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to engage in the study of Torah. Amen. So this week we come to a new Torah portion, Bashalach. And it spans all the way from Exodus chapter 13, verses 17, all the way up to chapter 17. The first verse in the Torah talks about, and this Torah portion talks about Pharaoh sending out the children of Israel. He sends them out of Egypt. And then the last verse in this Torah portion talks about Amalek, as if to show you they go from one enemy to another enemy. Now my slides up. We're going to see. Are these the updated version of my slides? Because I just updated them. They're not up there. Nothing's working today. Forget about the slides. We're just going rogue.
Did you save it?
I did not. We're going rogue today. All right, we're going rogue. All right, it's been that kind of week. Okay. So, a major theme in this Torah portion is nothing is stable. Last week we talked about this theme of deliverance from your inner Egypt, staring down the inner hole that you have, right? That inner well of darkness, right? This week I want to focus and shift, right? Because now we are a redeemed people. It's that change of mindset. Something happens with the death of the firstborn as they're leaving Egypt, where their mindset shifts. There's a shift in the mindset. It's like, now I know I'm redeemed. Now I know I'm not an Egyptian anymore. But there's still a little bit of a desire to go back to Egypt. Not necessarily go back to the lifestyle, but more the comfort, the ease. Right? Because when you are in Egypt, there's a sense of stability that comes with that. Even though the conditions aren't ideal, there's an attractiveness to Egypt because Egypt provides a sense of stability, a sense of knownness. Right? I know that in the morning I'm going to get up and go to the city that we're building and build bricks for Pharaoh. I know that in return, I'm going to have my pot of meat for my family and my bread for my family. I know that my family won't starve. I may get beaten, but at the end of the day, we will live. Sure, maybe I'll have some of my children thrown to the river now and then, but at least I know what to expect. And then God calls the children of Israel out. He calls them to the desert, and he says, my slides aren't still working. He says, I need you to trust me every step of the way. And here's an interesting thing in this Torah portion. Notice how often they change directions. They change directions, they go different places, they leave where they were and they go to a new place. And they grumble every step of the way. The children of Israel grumble every step of the way. But at every step of the way, that's God showing the fact that he's dependable and also showing the fact that this is another place where you can learn about Torah. Rashi, the great sage, he makes an interesting comment at the book beginning of Genesis. And I have it here. He has an interesting comment. My slides back there aren't even working, so I'm going to need to be flexible. But his comment at the book of Genesis 1:1, he says something very interesting. He says, when it says, Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, what it's really, he takes that word Bereshit. And if you take the ba out of the beginning of Reshit, right, you have Reshit, which means the beginning, and you have the beit at the beginning, which means Bereshit. But if you take out the B, you have the beginning. And right? And you look to the Proverbs, you look to Jeremiah, it says that the Reshit of God's crops is Israel. And the beginning of all things is wisdom, the wisdom of Torah, and that's from the Proverbs. And Rashi says two things. He says the purpose of creation was twofold. It was for Israel and its Torah. The purpose for your existence, right, in this world, the world's existence is for Israel and the Torah. In order for one to exist, the other has to exist. So, as the children of Israel go through the desert, they're learning what it means to be called Am Segulah. Am Segulah means a treasured people. They're God's treasured people. And they learn that as God's treasured people, they have a responsibility. We don't just leave the bondage of Egypt and go out into the wilderness. We also have a responsibility. We have work to do, right? The Passover Seder was called Avoda. You know, it was also called Avoda, the bondage of Egypt. Really, you did not leave behind a master to go free, right? You left the master of darkness, of the dark side, the evil principalities, to go to the master, the one true God. And his yoke is light. So, I'm going to read in Exodus 13. I'm going to read from the Hebrew. Vahi bashalach paro et ha'am. And it came to pass when Pharaoh sent away the people. V'lo nacham Elohim derech eretz Plishtim. And God did not lead them by the way of the Philistines. Ki charovchu, even though it was near. Ki amar Elohim, for God said, Pen yinachem ha'am be'otam milchama, lest they see war. V'shavu mitzrayma, and return to Egypt. A couple things here. No shortcuts. No shortcuts, right? If you look at the map, are you guys working on my slides? All right. So, we're going to skip some of these slides. The point is, no shortcuts. And I want you to get that in your mind. There's a reason there's a delay. There's a reason there's going to be the long trip through the south of Arabia all the way to the eastern border of the Holy Land. We're not doing an easy cut through the land of the Philistines, which is at the southern border of Israel. We're not doing an easy cut. There's a couple of reasons. But the Midrash is very interesting when it talks about this. It says there's a couple of reasons. And this is like very upper level, not really deep. It says the first reason for this delay was basically, think of it in terms of a parable of a king. A king has 12 sons, right? And he has 10 estates, right? He has to leave an estate to each son, but he has 10 estates. But he realizes that they're not yet ready to receive the 2 additional estates he's about to require. So think of it this way. East of the Jordan River are the kingdoms of Og and Sihon. When the children of Israel come through this area 40 years later, they will defeat these 2 armies and kingdoms, which actually represent strongholds in their life. They're not yet ready to defeat those strongholds yet. They're not strong enough. So that's why they're delaying. And then once those 2 additional estates are acquired, they're able to move into the land, and each tribe has its own territory. Another obvious explanation is that the children of Israel did not know how to live in the land. Right? If the children of Israel go into the land right now after they've been redeemed, after they've been steeped in Egyptian paganism, right? Are they going to be able to stand firm in the midst of the pagan Canaanite culture and not adopt the Canaanite practices? No. They're not. So that's what the 40 years journey in the wilderness is. It's a school. It's a school so they can learn. They can learn the ways of God. Because many of the Torah commandments will talk about what do you do as a people in the land. You will work your land for 6 years, but the 7th year is a Shemitah. What about the servant who goes free in the 7 years? What about tithing the crops to the Levite and to the priestly system? There is a bunch of rules and Torah commands that they have to learn that apply specifically to that land. And they think of it this way. Again, with the king, he has a son, right? That son is an heir to an estate. But that son is a little boy. He's 3 years old. He does not know how to read and write, and he does not know the value of that estate and how to keep that estate running. So what he does is he sends the son to school first, so the son can learn to read and write, and he reads the laws of the land, and he understands what value that estate has. That is a reason for the delay. My slides aren't working again, but that's all right. So, another interesting perspective at Genesis 13, verse 17, it says, Vayhi bashalach paro, Pharaoh sent away the people. Et ha'am, he sent away the people, et ha'am. V'lo nacham Elohim derech eretz plishtim, and God does not lead them by the way of the Philistines. Another look, this will show God's character during this wilderness journey. It's one of, I want you all to say the word rechem. Rechem. It means womb. It's also related to the Hebrew word rachem, right? You can say rachem. Say rachem. Rachem and rechem are related. Basically, rachem means compassion. But we read that in our Bibles, and we don't really understand the full extent of it. During this wilderness journey, while they're going through the wilderness, they'll be learning about God's nature of rachem, which basically the best way to describe it is you look at it at the womb, but you also look at it as a mother-bear instinct. If you're Israel, that's what God feels about you. It's mother-bear. It's basically, you know, when you're going to Tennessee in the Smoky Mountains, you don't get between a mother bear and her cub, or you're going to face the wrath of that mother bear. And the next verse is kind of interesting. I wish I could pull it up, but I can't. It says, Vayesev Elohim et ha'am. He leads the people. And in the Vayesev, it shows a dot, right? It shows a dot. Yeah, it's up there. And it shows the Vayesev, the Samek, which is the circle letter, has a dot in the middle, which is showing that God's surrounding his people. I love technology, don't you? It's nice when it works, but it's not so nice when it doesn't work. But what I'm trying to say is this rachem concept is so important because it shows God's nature, that mother-bear nature. He's going to take care of his children no matter what. But he's also going to protect them no matter what either. And this is where it gets interesting in our first verse in our Torah portion. It says, V'lo nacham Elohim, and he did not lead them by the way of the Philistines. And in one grammar stem, Hebrew has like 7 stems. It's basically, they have 7 verb tenses, if that makes sense. And in one of those verb tenses, you can read v'lo nacham as he did not lead. But in another verb stem, if you use it, v'lo nacham means he was not comforted. And this is going to hit really hard. It hit me hard. V'lo nacham means, what the rabbi said is, the 10 plagues in Egypt, God felt like he was playing nice with the Egyptians. If that makes sense. He felt like he was being too compassionate. Because it says, Vayhi bashalach paro et ha'am, v'lo nacham Elohim. V'lo nacham Elohim. The Elohim refers to God's name of judgment. he's literally drawing the Egyptians out. Think of it this story. The Midrash takes this story. It says, a king sends his son on a trip. A band of robbers attacks the king's son, right? They tie him up, they torture him, they beat him, they force him into slavery. And the king sends an army to rescue his son, right? He rescues his son. And then he gets the son back, and he's just overwhelmed with happiness to see his son. But as he's looking at the men tied up who hurt his son, he's comforted that his son is safe and sound. But he knows that full justice hasn't been extracted. And he sees the Egyptians, and he sees they lost their firstborn. They lost a lot, but full justice hasn't been extracted yet. They murdered my children's children by drowning them in the river. It's time for them to pay. And that's just a look into the nature of God. It's like not comfortable looking at this nature of God. But when we are in the camp of Israel, and we remember that our flesh and struggles, right, our fleshly struggles are really not against man. It's really against the spiritual principalities, right? That those are the real enemy. The real enemy in Egypt was not necessarily the Egyptian people. It was the Egyptian God system. That really what God wanted to do was have the Egyptians see that he was God, but single-handedly demolish their God system. And really, at the end of the day, the God system that was responsible for oppressing his own people was still intact. And that needed to die at the sea. And that's why the Yam Suf, that's the name of the Red Sea. It's called the Sea of Reeds, Yam Suf. Suf means reeds, Yam means sea. But Suf also means end, because something ends there at the sea. So, we all read the story about the Sea of Reeds, Red Sea, Yam Suf, and we learn that the Egyptian army drowns there. And with that, the Egyptians know who the one true God is. Right? And then we have Exodus 15, which is the Song of Moses, which is the response to that. And it's there to show us that at the points of victory in our life, the mark of a true believer is someone who turns around and thanks God for that. Because there's an overwhelming sense of, that could have been me in the sea, but the waters that saved me were the waters that drowned the enemy coming after me. There's that sense. So there's that song, and it's kind of interesting because there's another spiritual principle at play here. It says in Exodus 15, verse 1. I'm going to turn there, and I'm going to read the Hebrew. It says, Az yashir Moshe uvnei Yisrael et chashirah hazot ladonai. Az yashir Moshe, then Moses sang, uvnei Yisrael, and the children of Israel, et chashirah hazot, this song, ladonai, to Adonai. Az yashir. That should be past tense. Guys, can you just turn off my slides? They're not working. Yeah, just turn them off. So it says, Az Yashir. Az Yashir. And Yashir, then Moses sang, right? That's the word he sang. There's one problem with that translation, though. It's future tense. It's future tense. Yashir is not past tense. It's future tense. So this is how you should read it. Then Moses will sing, and the children of Israel will sing this song to Hashem. It should be read future tense, because that's the way Hebrew grammar is, but it's been translated past tense. And that's like the scholars struggle with that difficulty, and the rabbis spill a lot of ink over it. And they say it's two things. First of all, in the Messianic age, the redemption that will ensue will cause God's people to no longer remember coming out of Egypt, because the redemption that's coming in that age will be far greater. And at the end of that, they will sing a song to God. And it's a prophecy of resurrection from the dead. Moses and that generation from that came out of Egypt will again rise from the dead. And that's they will rise from the dead and sing that song. That is one opinion. Another opinion follows this train of thought. Az Yashir. If you keep in mind, Hebrew has 7 verb tenses. So another verb tense is causative, meaning that Moses and the children in Israel caused to sing this song to Adonai. They caused God to sing with them. And this goes in connection with that Racham mentality. As they're going through the wilderness, what they're learning is that how you treat others in the wilderness and how you treat God and how you view your circumstances affects how God treats you, if that makes sense. That's part of the Torah mentality. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And if you can do that, you will experience God loves you no matter what, if you are his child and if you're trying to walk. But if you are trying to love your neighbor, right, God will show that to you. It's in Psalms 121, verse 5, it says, God is my shadow, but it also says, that phrase also says, God is my shade. That when we sing to God, God sings with us. And it's about him loving us so deeply that he wants to be a part of everything we do. And that the whole purpose of creation is for Israel and the Torah to bring this world into one with God, where it's like a mirror. Heaven and earth are like a mirror. So that is interesting. Keep that in mind. So they have this song, and it comes to the point where it's time to leave. In Exodus 15, verse 22, it says, Vayasa Moshe et Yisrael miyam suf. And Moses leads the people onward from the Sea of Suf, the Sea of Reeds, the Red Sea. And it's kind of interesting because in every other section of the Torah, when it uses Vayasa, it uses it in the tense Vayisa. Say Vayisa. Vayisa. It means they left. Say Vayasa. That's what's used here. Vayasa. He led. It's causative. It's heful. It's one of those stems. Remember what I said? Hebrew has 7 stems. Vayisa is the most common used. It's simple call stem. It's the simple stem. But heful is the stem that shows that the action that I am doing is causing another person to do another action. They're not really doing it of their own accord. I'm making them do it, if that makes sense. So it says, Moses here caused the people to go onward from the sea. He made them. They did not do it of their own accord. Here's the thing, the rabbis spilled a lot of ink studying this too. And here's what they came to. It talks about how Egypt was still, even though they're out of Egypt, Egypt is not out of them. Egypt is not out of them. And that's showing that they had just won at the sea, right? God had just fought the battle for them. The rabbis talk about all the gold that just came off of the chariots, right? The way the Egyptians built their chariots, the jewelry, the gold, and the wealth from all those chariots that washed ashore and decked on the Egyptians, right? So they have this wealth here. They have materialism. And they're like, we can go back to Egypt and we'll be kings, right? Their armies destroyed, their nations destroyed. If we go back in, we can rule like kings. We'll be like upper class now, and they'll be the servants. And they want to go back to the stability, and they still want to go back to Egypt. But that's not what God calls them to do. Because Moses has to lead them away from that. He says, I'm not calling you back to Egypt. I'm calling you to the wilderness, to Torah. So they journey a 3 days journey, right? They journey a 3 days journey. They leave the wilderness of Red Sea, and they go into the wilderness of Shur, Midbar Shur. And what's the significance of the wilderness of Shur? Shur means in the Hebrew, it can mean to like clay. It refers to clay. Actually, I was wrong. It means boundaries. There's another word coming up that means clay. But Shur means boundaries. What God is teaching them is, if you're going to be my people, there are boundaries you have to follow. At the end of the day, it's what this Torah is. It's boundaries. It's for your protection, but also it's so you can learn how to approach a holy God, how to show God's light, how to be the proper conduit of God's light to the nations, and what that means. You have a responsibility now. And so they journey 3 days. They find the spring called Mara because the waters are bitter. They have no water. And really what this is a symbology of is they are not studying Torah, if that makes sense. Because Torah is likened to water. It's 3 days without Torah. And they're grumbling, right? And what does Moses tell them to do? Right? Take the tree, take the etz, right? And the rabbis say what's pretty interesting about this tree was it was bitter too. And you take this bitter tree and you come over here, Moses, and you throw it in the water, this bitter water, and the water will become sweet. And what's the spiritual application for us? If you go to Numbers in Deuteronomy, actually Numbers I believe it is, it talks about how man is like a field of the tree, and that's chasade. He's a field of the tree. That man's a tree of the field. And man who is this tree who's bitter, right? If you're in a stage of life where you're bitter and you're grumbling at God because your circumstances, right, aren't going the way you want them to go, what do you do in your moments of bitterness? You immerse yourself in Torah. And God gives them this water that is sweet. Because this water, this Torah that seems bitter at first glance, becomes sweet because you get immersed in it. And you realize who you are. The biggest thing the Torah does is it shows who you are as a child of God. That you are Israel. And because of that, this universe was created for you to serve God. If that makes sense. It was created so you and God could be one, right? So in this bitter water, it now becomes sweet because you're immersing in it. And how do we know it's talking about Torah, this water? Because it says in verse 25 of chapter 15, he says, after he casts it into the waters, and the waters are made sweet, it says, Shamsam lo chok umishpat. And there he gave them a chok and a mishpat. A chok are the commands we don't understand that God gives us. It says, like the command of the red heifer. And a mishpat. What is a mishpat? Like the command of Sabbath. We understand that. It's nice having a day off. It's nice having the seventh day off to rest. We get that. But what's the deeper significance of these two? It represents resurrection, right? The hok represents the red heifer, right? The rabbis say they were studying the red heifer. We don't know that. But it's kind of interesting they brought that up. They were studying the red heifer and they were studying Sabbath. Two things which represent purification from death and resurrection. they're studying that here at the Spring of Bitter Waters. Because it's showing them, if you want this in your life, you have to immerse yourself in Torah. The living Torah is Yeshua. You have to immerse yourself in him. You have to study the commandments and see how God works everything in your life to bring redemption through his son. You have to study that and see that and let his word become a part of who you are. It's almost like you get thrown into it and you become like a sponge. And it's not like you're trying to drink from a fire hydrant, but rather that you as a sponge are just soaking up as much as you can. And it's kind of interesting because at the end of that paragraph, in verse 26, God says, I will not put the diseases of Egypt on you. Ki ani Adonai rofecha, because I am your healer. And that's what it's talking about there. So, they come to Elim, right? And there's 12 springs of water, 12. Each tribe has its own source of water. Keep in mind that water represents Torah, so they have their Torah. And then there's 70 palm trees. Why 70 palm trees? How many elders were over Israel? 70. That's the Sanhedrin. That's showing you that part of that study of engaging in Torah is recognizing the Torah itself, but also giving credibility to those who are older and wiser in the study of Torah and recognizing their input. You may disagree with me on that. That's okay. I just had to throw that in there. And then they come and they leave there and they come to the wilderness of Sin. And why Sin? That's in between Shur, Elim, and Sinai. And why are we in the wilderness of Sin? Because that means a thorn bush. So what they're going through feels like affliction. But it also means clay. Because it shows them that they are being molded in this season. This is a season where they're being molded. And they're under pressure, similar to they were in pressure in Egypt. And sometimes the pressure of being in this part of the wilderness feels like it's a little harder than Egypt. I wish I could go back to Egypt. But you have to understand God's molding you. And you're not a slave anymore. You're a child of God. And there is responsibilities, but you're learning about that. And in the wilderness of Sin, they grumble. And what do they grumble for? They grumble for manna, and they grumble for meat. They said, we sat at the meat pots when we were in Egypt, and we ate our fill of bread. And really, what it's saying is, they looked at the necessities of their life, what they needed to survive, the bread, and they looked at the luxuries that were available, the meat. Because you don't need meat to live, but you need bread to live. And they looked at these two things, and they realized how they were common knowns. They were knowns in the land of Egypt. Their life wasn't the greatest, but at least they were taken care of. So keep that in your mind. And what God does is He gives them that in the form of quail. He gives them that in the form of bread. He first, at the beginning of the day, He sends the manna, the bread. And at the end of the day, He sends the quail. Why? To show you that He will take care of your needs first. And then after that, He takes care of the luxuries, right? What you don't need. But as the Father, it's important for Him to take care of the needs. What's also important about this? To show them that they are to keep His Sabbath. Because here, He says you gather twice on the sixth day, the amount that you would gather. So on the first day, you gather an omer, right? But on the sixth day, you gather 2 omers per person, right? And so, on the sixth day, they gather 2 omers to show them that He is going to take care of them as long as they keep His commandments. If they trust Him, and saying, God, I take upon the yoke of your commandments. I'm going to honor your Sabbath. I'm going to honor your commandments, Father. I'm going to do the best I can to honor you. Then the Lord will take care of you. And that's a trust. And that's what he's showing them there. And it's a little bit of a challenge for them, right? Because Moses, he's so caught up that he forgets to even tell them to gather on the Sabbath. And God even addresses him like, why did you forget my commandments? It's in the text. If you look at the Hebrew, it's like God's addressing Moses. And the people themselves kind of struggle with this too. It's this trust, right? When we're in Egypt, it's a known. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago. What's the difference between the land of Egypt and the land of Israel where they're going, right? Keep in mind that Israelites are going to the promised land. The land of Egypt, they get their source of life from the physical world. They get it from the ground. The Nile overflows, and that waters the fields of Egypt. The water comes from the ground. The sustenance comes from the ground. But in the land of Israel, it comes from the heavens. It comes in the form of rain. And that's how they know that their dependence comes from heaven in the land of Israel. And that's the mindset God's preparing them for. And so they learn about the Sabbath. And so they move on from there, and they grumble about water again. And then what happens? They say something. They ask Moses a question. They ask him, how do we know God is with us? Right? That's Exodus 17, verse 17. How do we know God is with us? I'm going to go there. It's kind of like at the end of it. Actually, I was wrong. It's verse 7. And the name of the place was called Massah and Meribah, because of the striving of the children of Israel, because they tried the Lord, saying, Chayesh Adonai bekirbenu im ayin. Is he with us or not? They asked that question. What does the next verse say? It says, Vayavo Amalek vayilachem im Yisrael. And Amalek came and warred with Israel. It's really showing them, is God with you or not? And it's like, that's an interesting way to answer that question, right? Is God with me or not? My enemy comes to fight with me. And the rabbis say, think of it as a father who's carrying his child on his shoulders. And the child is like, is my dad with me or not? I can't see my dad. And my dad's head's right here. I'm on his shoulders. Can I see my dad or not? I can't see my dad or not. I'm not really getting the things I want. He doesn't really care. What's he even protecting me from? And then the father's like, fine, I'll sit you down. And then a dog comes up and snarls at the child. And the child knows that the whole time the father was carrying him, he was safe. And so, that's the moral here. And it's kind of interesting, how do they defeat Amalek? Moses keeps his hands up, right? He raises his hands up the whole time. His hands are up. And when his hands are down, his hands are too weak, Amalek prevails. When his hands are up, Amalek is starting to be defeated again. And so they support his hands. Joshua and Hur support his hands. And Israel's able to overcome. The rabbis say something very interesting here. You know what they say the hands up refers to? Refers to prayer. It refers to the Psalms. When the Psalms say, I lift my hands to God. What it's really saying is if you really want to win in all areas, because the enemies of Israel, you're an Israelite, your enemies are not going away. Just because Egypt drowned in the sea doesn't mean you don't have more enemies around the corner. If you're a child of God, you always will have enemies. What he's saying is, here's how you beat them with prayer. You pray more in your life. But also God makes a promise. And this is the last verse in the Torah portion. He says, God makes a promise. He says, Ki yad al kesya. The hand of God is upon the throne of Yah. And it's kind of interesting here. We'll come back to this. Milchama l'Adonai ba'amalach midor dor. God himself will make war against Israel's enemy Amalek from generation to generation. This is eternal. But he says, Ki yad al kes yah. Ki yad, for the hand, al kes is over the throne of Yah. Here's an interesting thing. Kes should be keser or keser. It's incomplete. And Yah is an abbreviation of God's complete name. And what God is doing here is he's making a promise here. He's saying, I'm going to take care of you while you are in the wilderness. And when you leave the wilderness and go into the land, I will take care of you too. And when you are in the land and when you get exiled to Babylon and Persia and Rome and the other ends of the world, I will still take care of you. But my hand will be against Amalek the whole time, because Amalek, he too will he will go down through the generations. And you know who the spiritual descendant of Amalek and Esau is? Rome. The Roman culture, it's that same, and they're not the physical ancestor, but it's the same way Babylon, Persia, Greek, and Rome. It's that same hatred, that same desire to subjugate God's people. And he says, my hand is against that. And his throne is incomplete, and his name is incomplete until that is conquered, until they're completely blotted out. And that's a promise, because it says in Zechariah, in the Messianic days, Ushmo Echad, his name shall be one, and his kingdom will be one. And that's a promise for us. But until that promise is complete, we are walking through our own wilderness experience. We are a redeemed people. But we have a responsibility. There's work for us to do. It is time for us to study the Word of God, the Torah. Because there are parts of the Torah called chukot that we don't understand. And then there are parts called mishpatim where we think we understand them. But in reality, we don't understand it to the fullest. Furthermore, we need to adopt an approach to Torah as a people. In the Hebrew mindset, we're all like a fish. We're like a fish. If a fish is taken out of water, it can't live. If we're taken out of the Torah, we can't live. But here's another thing I also want you to think about. That while we're pursuing the calling God has with us, each of us following Torah and learning more about Torah, we also have to learn to trust God that our life on earth is not going to be easy. This time in the desert, right, in the midbar, it's not going to be easy. We're going to be walking through it and wondering where our sustenance is going to come from. But we have to trust that God is protecting us. We have to trust his nature of Rachum, which means that he nourishes us. He gives us our daily bread. And he takes care of us that way. It says the children of Israel came out of the land, and not one of their clothes were even torn. It was because of that cloud of glory that covered them while they walked through the wilderness. Constantly took care of them. It was like that motherly attention God gave them. And also keeping in mind that he fights for us and he fights with us. That's a big part. Now, how many minutes do I have? How many minutes of discussion? We actually have no time left. Congratulations. I managed. All right. Well, I am going to close with a blessing. Before I do, I want to say I'm sorry if it seemed a little disjointed. Technology was a little crazy this morning. And also, I was a little sick this week, so hopefully next week will be better. We'll see. But anyway, let me close with the blessing over the Torah portion. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has placed everlasting life in our midst. Amen.